What the National Weather Service, the National Hurricane Center, and the team of professional meteorologists and atmospheric scientists who have been monitoring the developing weather situation across the Atlantic Basin and the broader eastern United States, with the most sophisticated suite of forecasting tools, satellite observation systems, numerical weather prediction models, and atmospheric data collection networks ever assembled in the history of weather science have just issued in the form of a new and urgent warning. For the East Coast is not the kind of routine seasonal advisory that coastal residents learn to filter out after years of living in a region where weather warnings are a regular feature of the communication landscape, not the kind of precautionary statement that forecasters issue when the atmospheric situation is ambiguous and they want to err on the side of caution without genuinely believing that a serious threat is materializing, and not the kind of language that professional meteorologists who are trained to communicate uncertainty carefully and who understand the consequences of warning fatigue use when the actual threat level does not justify the alarm that strong warning language generates in the public that receives it. What has been issued is a genuine, evidence-based, urgently communicated warning, grounded in atmospheric observations, forecast model output, and the professional judgment of the most experienced weather forecasters in the country that the next 10 days represent a period of elevated and potentially dangerous weather threat for communities along the East Coast that demands serious attention, serious preparation, and the kind of informed individual response that can make the critical difference between experiencing a severe weather period as a manageable challenge and experiencing it as a catastrophic and potentially life-threatening event whose impacts were preventable with adequate warning and adequate preparation. The specific weather threats that the new forecaster warning encompasses are not limited to a single hazard or a single weather system, but represent a compound and overlapping sequence of potentially dangerous atmospheric events that are expected to develop, intensify, and affect different portions of the East Coast on a rolling timeline across the full 10-day period covered by the warning, creating a sustained period of weather risk that is more complex, more varied, and more geographically extensive than the single event severe weather scenarios that most East Coast residents are more accustomed to preparing for and responding to as part of. The normal rhythms of living in a region whose geographic position, whose proximity to the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, and whose location at the intersection of the multiple atmospheric air masses that collide along the East Coast's latitudinal span make it one of the most meteorologically active and most weather hazard-rich regions of the United States across every season of the year. The tropical component of the warning, the portion of the 10-day forecast that involves the development, the intensification, and the potential landfall or close approach of tropical systems that the National Hurricane Center is monitoring in the Atlantic Basin, and that the forecast models are tracking on trajectories that could bring tropical weather impacts to portions of the East Coast within the warning period, is the component the Waimim Onek. T carries the most dramatic and most potentially catastrophic weather impact potential because tropical systems arriving at the East Coast carry the combination of storm surge, extreme rainfall, destructive winds, and widespread power outages that have produced some of the most devastating and most costly weather disasters in the recorded history of East Coast communities. Disasters whose names have entered the collective memory of coastal residents as permanent reminders of what the Atlantic hurricane season is capable of delivering to communities that are not adequately prepared for the full range of tropical weather impacts. The forecast track uncertainty that is inherent in 10-day tropical weather prediction, the expanding cone of possible storm positions that grows with forecast lead time to reflect the genuine limitations of even the most sophisticated atmospheric prediction systems in projecting the behavior of tropical systems over extended periods, means that the specific communities that will ultimately experience the most significant tropical weather impacts cannot be identified with the precision that would allow perfectly targeted preparation, creating a situation where a broad swath of East Coast communities from Florida to New England must take the warning seriously and begin preparation activities without yet knowing exactly which portions of the coast will experience the most direct and most severe impacts when the tropical systems that forecasters are monitoring actually arrive. The non-tropical components of the 10-day weather warning for the East Coast add additional layers of threat to an already concerning forecast period, with the collision of multiple air masses producing severe thunderstorm risk across broad inland areas, the potential for significant rainfall totals that create flooding risk across watersheds that may already be at elevated moisture levels from preceding weather events, the possibility of significant temperature swings that create stress on power infrastructure and human health, and the development of the kind of complex mid-latitude weather systems that can produce damaging winds, heavy precipitation, and hazardous conditions across large geographic areas, even in the absence of tropical influence. The storm surge threat, arguably the most immediately life-threatening component of any coastal weather event, significant enough to generate an official warning from the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, is a threat that the forecaster warning is emphasizing with the urgency that the historical record of storm surge fatalities justifies, because storm surge is the weather-related cause of death that is most preventable through timely evacuation, and that simultaneously claims the most lives in major coastal weather events because it is the hazard that residents most commonly underestimate, most commonly decide to shelter through rather than evacuate from, and most commonly find themselves unable to escape once the surge begins rising faster than the pace of human movement through. Flooded streets and roads can accommodate. The coastal communities from the Carolinas through the mid-Atlantic states and into the Northeast that lie within the zone of potential storm surge impact from the systems that forecasters are warning about over the next 10 days include communities whose geographic characteristics, their low elevation, their position on barrier islands or peninsulas, their limited evacuation route capacity, and the characteristics of the offshore bathymetry that determines how much the winds of an approaching storm can pile water against the coastline before it arrives, make them particularly vulnerable to the rapid and potentially life-threatening inundation that major storm surge events produce. Communities whose residents need to understand their specific storm surge vulnerability, their specific evacuation zone designation, and their specific evacuation route and destination now, before the forecast becomes more certain and before the window for orderly evacuation closes as the approaching weather systems move closer, and the roads become more congested with the surge of last-minute evacuees that inevitably accompanies the issuance of mandatory evacuation orders. The rainfall flooding threat that the 10-day forecast period encompasses is a threat that extends far beyond the immediate coastal zone into the inland communities that lie along the river systems and in the topographic basins where rainfall from tropical and non-tropical systems concentrates and produces the kind of freshwater flooding that has in recent years killed more people in East Coast weather events than storm surge itself in some cases, as the experience of communities along inland waterways in the Appalachian foothills, the Piedmont, and the river valleys of the Mid-Atlantic and New England states has demonstrated repeatedly that the most dangerous flooding in major East Coast weather events is not always at the coast, but maybe hundreds of miles inland where the geography concentrates runoff from catastrophic rainfall totals into rivers and streams that rise with a terrifying speed to levels that overwhelm the flood protection infrastructure and the evacuation capacity of communities whose residents may not have considered themselves to be at significant flood risk. The power outage risk that accompanies any major East Coast weather event of the scale that the 10-day warning describes is a risk whose consequences extend far beyond the inconvenience of darkened homes and disrupted routines to encompass the medical. Emergencies that occur when people dependent on electrically powered medical equipment lose power for extended periods, the food safety and food access emergencies that extended power outages create for communities whose food storage and food preparation depends on refrigeration and electric cooking, the communication disruption that prevents affected residents from receiving emergency information and requesting emergency assistance, and the broader community function disruption that extended widespread power outages impose on hospitals, emergency services, water treatment facilities, and every other piece of critical infrastructure whose continued function is essential for community safety and welfare during and after a major weather event. The preparation actions that East Coast residents should be taking right now in response to the new 10-day warning from forecasters encompass the full range of emergency preparedness activities that major weather events demand, reviewing and confirming evacuation plans and evacuation destinations for residents in coastal and flood-vulnerable areas, assembling or restocking emergency supply kits with adequate water, non-perishable food, medications, and other essential supplies, securing outdoor property and making any available structural preparations to reduce property damage from high winds, confirming the location and the operating hours of local emergency shelters, ensuring that vehicles are fueled and ready for evacuation if the forecast evolution makes evacuation necessary, and monitoring the National Hurricane Center and National Weather Service advisories closely and frequently to stay informed about the evolving forecast as the 10-day warning period progresses and the atmospheric situation develops in ways that will allow forecasters to progressively narrow the uncertainty in their predictions and provide increasingly specific guidance about where the most severe impacts will occur and when. The emergency management infrastructure that supports East Coast communities during major weather events, the county and municipal emergency management agencies that coordinate local response and that issue the evacuation orders and emergency declarations that direct community action during approaching weather threats, the state emergency management agencies that coordinate cross-county and cross-municipal response, and that manage the state-level resources that supplement local response capability when weather events exceed local capacity, and the federal emergency management infrastructure, including FEMA, that provides the resources and the coordination that major disasters require, when they exceed the capacity of state and local systems to manage alone, has been activated or is in the process of activation across the East Coast states that fall within the warning zone, with emergency managers at every level monitoring the evolving forecast, prepositioning resources, coordinating evacuation planning, and preparing the response infrastructure that will be needed when the weather systems that forecasters are warning about arrive at the coast and begin imposing the impacts that the warning predicts. The communication challenge that emergency managers face during a 10-day warning period, maintaining appropriate public urgency about a real and serious threat while managing the inevitable uncertainty about the specific timing, the specific intensity, and the specific geographic distribution of impacts that characterizes weather forecasts at 10-day. Lead times is a challenge that requires careful calibration of warning language, careful explanation of forecast uncertainty, and careful guidance about what actions are appropriate at different stages of the warning period that can be undertaken now to reduce risk without requiring the most disruptive and most resource-intensive actions like evacuation that are more appropriately timed to the later stages of the warning period when the forecast has become more specific and more certain about which communities face the most serious and most imminent threat. The broader context of this 10-day East Coast warning, the atmospheric conditions, the oceanic conditions, and the large-scale climate patterns that are contributing to a forecast period of such sustained and varied weather threat across such a broad geographic area, reflects the current state of the Atlantic weather environment that meteorologists have been monitoring with increasing concern throughout a hurricane season that has produced conditions favorable to active and intense tropical development across the Atlantic basin, conditions that are now manifesting in the specific forecast evolution that has prompted the issuance of a 10-day warning covering the entire East Coast, and that represents one of the most comprehensive and most urgent official weather warnings that the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center have issued for the East Coast region in recent memory. Take this warning seriously. Prepare your household and your community for the weather impacts that the next 10 days may bring to East Coast communities. Across the full span of the warning zone, monitor the evolving forecast closely and frequently for the updates that will progressively narrow the uncertainty in the predictions and allow more specific and more actionable guidance about the timing and the location of the most serious impacts, and act on the preparation guidance that emergency managers at every level are now communicating with the urgency that a 10-day period of compound and overlapping weather threats for the East Coast genuinely and unavoidably demands from every resident who lives within the warning zone and who has the opportunity right now to take the preparation actions that could make the critical difference between safety and catastrophe when the weather systems that forecasters are warning about arrive. Like this video, if this complete and urgently important analysis of the new forecaster warning for the East Coast over the next 10 days gave you the understanding, the context, and the specific guidance you need to take this warning as seriously as the forecasters who issued it intend, and to prepare your household and your community with the urgency that the compound weather threats of the next 10 days demand. Subscribe to this channel for the kind of serious, scientifically grounded, and genuinely protective weather coverage that the most dangerous weather periods demand from anyone committed to providing East Coast residents with the information they need to protect themselves and their families from the overlapping and compound weather threats that the next 10 days of this extraordinary forecast period may bring to communities from Florida to Maine. See you in the next one.